So thanks, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. As some of you might have seen from the invitation, after the passing of Justice Ginsburg last week, we thought it would be appropriate to open the webinar today with some reflection and acknowledgements of the legacy of Justice Ginsburg, given the theme that we're talking about. And very graciously, Dean Trevor Morrison from NYU School of Law has agreed to give some brief remarks. Dean Morrison, previously served as Associate Counsel to President Barack Obama and clerked for Judge Betty Fletcher on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, as well as clerking for Justice Ginsburg on the Supreme Court. And so without further ado, I would invite Dean Morrison.
Thank you, John, and greetings to everyone who's joined this session this evening. I'm really glad to know about this session and the work that so many people across the university have done to promote voting in this year's election, of course, but to promote a broader engagement in our civic and political life, and to think about ways that each of us as activists can be involved in promoting the kind of constitutional democracy that we want to live in. As John mentioned, of course, and as we all know, on Friday evening, we got the very sad news of Justice Ginsburg's passing. It was my great honor to work for her for a year, clerking in her chambers in 2002, 2003. And I carry with me many lessons from my time working for her, and lessons that her life and career have taught me and many of us. And as relevant to your topics this evening, I think what Justice Ginsburg's career reflects, among many things, is that change can come. It can be hard fought and hard won, and it can also be slow, but that it's worth taking the long view. You know, Justice Ginsburg, long before she was Justice Ginsburg, before she was Judge Ginsburg, she was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, lawyer and law professor. And in the 1970s, she really was the architect of the litigation strategy in a series of cases that went to the Supreme Court, pushing gender equality on the court. And this was a time when the Supreme Court's doctrine suggested that state or federal laws that discriminated on the basis of gender were not constitutionally suspect. That laws that treated people differently on the basis of their sex or their gender, as long as they were rational, should be upheld, that the courts should defer to legislative judgments in that area. And it was really, if you want, a form of activism in the form of litigation that was also a form of education, where then Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to teach the court to understand that these laws actually posed grave problems of inequality, of unjustifiable inequality, and to help move the court's doctrine in that direction. And she was succeeded in winning almost all of the cases that she was involved in litigating in front of the Supreme Court in the 1970s. But it wasn't until decades later that those efforts finally culminated in the courts formally embracing a doctrine of what in constitutional law we call heightened scrutiny, of treating laws that discriminate on the basis of gender as constitutionally suspect. And although the court moved in that direction in the late 70s and early 80s, the case really cementing that view of the law came in the mid-1990s in a case called the United States against Virginia, which was a challenge to the Virginia Military Institute's male-only admissions policy. And the justice who wrote the majority opinion, striking that admissions policy down and holding that it violated the equal protection of the laws as applied to gender, was none other than Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the same lawyer who advocated for that view of constitutional law in the 1970s. Then 2 decades later was the justice who wrote the opinion for the court that still stands today as the most significant articulation of the constitutional principle of gender equality under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And that by itself is, for me, just a really powerful illustration of the fact that if you want to push for change, you need to take the long view. You need to be prepared to devise a strategy and think about how to implement it over the long term. That's not to say, don't be an activist today. It's to say, think strategically, think about what kinds of alliances need to be forged to achieve real and lasting change, and sometimes temper the need for immediate change with a patience and understanding that durable change can take a while to achieve. Justice Ginsburg, I think, will forever be remembered as one of the most consequential people ever to serve on the Supreme Court when it comes to issues of equality and justice in particular. She did that over a long, long career. And when I think about my own life, I think about trying to achieve some small fraction of what she did, but thinking about doing that over the long arc of many decades. And I hope you'll think about that as well and take that kind of inspiration from her life and work. I miss her terribly, as does everyone who knew her personally, and the country misses her. But for those who are inspired by her work, I think it falls to us now to carry her legacy forward, and I commend that to all of you, and I thank you for your commitment to equality and to justice. With that, I'll turn things back to John.
Thank you very much, Dean Morrison, and for the that honoring of her Justice Ginsburg's legacy and the inspiring call to find some creative ways to honor that, and perhaps no time more appropriate than the one we find ourselves in. So I would like to turn it over now to Myrna Perez, Director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Election Program.
Bienvenidos, welcome. I'm Myrna Perez. I am Director of the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections Program. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the center, we are affiliated with NYU School of Law. We are named after the great Justice William Brennan, who made famous the idea of a living constitution. And by that, we mean the idea that the Constitution was not written in stone and is not with static frozen words, but rather needs to adapt and change according to the crises of the moment. And that's part of the guiding light of the Brennan Center. We are trying to figure out what are the ways in which our institutions of power are failing Americans, and how can we go about fixing them to make sure that we have a more robust and participatory democracy. I'm really grateful for the words that Dean Morrison said about Justice Ginsburg. I will note that as a voting rights lawyer, her loss is very much felt because she wrote a lot of decisions on the idea of voting. She was extraordinarily articulate about it. And I have been talking to a lot of reporters about the different ways in which she's had an impact on voting rights jurisprudence. And I think that there are three things that I'd like to note. I mean, one, I think people are being very melodramatic about saying like the fate of our democracy rested on her. And I don't actually think that that's accurate, because for the last few years, she was in the dissent. She was losing, and the difference between a 5-4 and a 6-3 is still a vote against voters. But I do think that she did three unique particular things that I think is important. The first is she had a real gift for performing what I would call an educative function through her decisions. She had a way of taking them and explaining things in a way that allowed folks who didn't spend their life reading decisions to be able to understand it. She's the only Supreme Court justice that I hear get quoted all the time. Like she famously said at the end of a major decision on voting rights in the Shelby County decision, that throwing away pre-clearance because it was working was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you weren't getting wet. And people say that all the time. Like everybody says that and when they're talking about the Voting Rights Act. And I think she was so good and so smart about evoking that in people. The second reason is that I think she did a lot to try and persuade the other more voter-friendly members of the court to think about their dissents and their concurrences in really strategic ways. Like you could see the leadership and the intellectual leadership that she provides in all of her opinions. And then third is I think she provided a lot of institutional legitimacy. I think we're at a time where in our country where we are reckoning for the things that we have done and the things that we have not done in this country, and all the ways in which our democracy does not represent all of us. And by being her and being such a pro-voter force and being as upfront and as clear and offering the moral guidance that she offered, I think really allowed people to say, you know what, the court isn't completely bankrupt as an institution. The court is not something that is irrelevant. It's not just an arm of the political party. It is an institution that is worth venerating, and sometimes it goes the way you want and sometimes it doesn't, but like she actually, just by being there and being who she was, I think protected the institution of the court and the legitimacy of the court. So she will be very, very sorely missed. I have been asked to talk to y'all about what's going on in our election, and I think the timing couldn't be more perfect. Tomorrow is National Voter Registration Day, so for all of you who are not registered, tomorrow is a good day to go and get registered. But I'm going to look at 3 different areas, and I'm going to look at them in the idea of what can we expect and what do we need? What can we expect and what do we need? Because as a civil rights lawyer, I tend to engage in the magical thinking that if I work long enough and hard enough, we can bend the moral arc of the universe closer to justice. And so I'm not going to be a person that thinks it's okay to despair. I'm not a person that thinks it's okay to be pessimistic. I'm not a person that thinks it's okay to wring your hands up the air and say that we need to give up, or that that it's lost. I think, you know, life is long. The country's history is long. And I think we're not going to see the kind of changes we want unless we all decide we're going to be part of it and we're going to be part of the solution. So I will tend to provide all of the things that I think are going to go wrong with some concrete things that I think we can do. So I'm going to go through a couple of buckets. The first thing that we can expect is a lot of people voting in person. And what do we need? We need to make sure that there are adequate numbers of people to vote in person at, which means that there's adequate polling places. Right now, it's very, very popular, especially among progressives, to talk a lot about vote by mail. And I think vote by mail is a really important way of accessing the polls, but we cannot forget that we still need our polling places, because there are some members of our community for whom polling places are never going to work. If you live on a Native American reservation, for example, there's a very good chance that your tribe conception of an address looks different than the post office conception of an address. If you are in a highly dense area or a highly rural area or a underserved or underfinanced area, you may not get quality mail service. And to ask that the process by which you change how the government responds to you, building on the back of a system that's already failing you, is just like a really bad feedback loop. And I think all of you who actually live in New York, especially if you live in new buildings, you guys know that spot on the radiator where all the mail just kind of like piles up because it's not clear which mailbox it belongs into. We can't ask people who have unreliable mail service to be dependent upon the mail service in order to change the way the government interacts with us. We also have people who have physical or visual impairments who cannot manipulate the paper of the vote by mail, the opening up the ballots, the reading the words, the stuffing it back in there, the sealing it, the dropping it off at the post office. And if we want the members of our community who have physical or visual impairments to be able to vote autonomously and independently, which I think we all do, we need to give them in-person options. We also have people who have language needs. And in some parts of this country, the election administrators are actually required by law to provide language assistance. That doesn't happen when it's a flat piece of paper that gets mailed to your address, but does happen when you have trained poll workers that are there. And then finally, for some members of our community, especially people that either they themselves or have family members that remember what it was like to put their body on the line for the right to vote, these are not folks that are going to be scared or deterred by a virus, right? Folks that had to deal with extreme violence, loss of employment, the kind of terror that happened when our country was at some of its bleaker times, are not going to be deterred by a virus. And so for those reasons, we need to make sure that polling places are critical now. They're also critical because there has been a lot of disparagement in vote by mail coming from all levels of government. And for that reason, there's going to be a lot of people that should be voting by mail or could be voting by mail that are going to choose not to. So we need to make sure that we have polling places. Some of the biggest lessons from this came from Wisconsin, where we saw that there were too few polling places. We saw in Milwaukee a consolidation from about 182 to 5 sites. We also saw massive poll worker shortages. And we saw people in homemade PPE standing outside in really, really long lines. Long lines in the past have been deterring and disenfranchising, but in the time of a once-in-a-century pandemic, they can also be deadly. So, so the upshot is that we need sufficient polling places so that people are getting the kinds of resources that they need. That way they can be voting quickly and that they know where they're supposed to vote. I'll note that this is taking on a specific tone in terms of racial justice, because we have discovered that people of color tend to wait longer in lines when they vote, and they tend to wait in the longest of lines. And it's not going to surprise y'all to hear that the people that suffer the most in terms of resources per voter, like how many voting machines do they get per voter, how many polling workers do they get per voter, how many poll sites do they get per voter, are those communities that are undergoing rapid demographic shifts. So stable communities, even if they're of color, tend to have a similar level of resources as stable white communities. But these communities that are undergoing big changes as they become less white and more poor, we tend to see a fewer number of resources per vote. So that's something we need to stay on top of. How do we fix this? Well, we need to make sure that we have adequate and equitable polling locations. We need to make sure that when there's consolidations that are required, that they're done justly. We need to make sure that there's a lot of poll workers that are out there, and that is my big plug for all of you guys who are looking for things to do. Sign up to be a poll worker in your neighborhood, and to just make sure that you are going to be part of the solution to making sure that our polling places operate smoothly on election day. Okay, so we went through bucket number 1. We're going to have a lot of people voting in person. The second thing is we need to make sure that these poll places that I just told you we need to have, that they operate in a prepared way and they're what we call resilient against crisis. What does that look like? Making sure that they have enough backup stuff. You know, if the machines are going to go down, make sure they have machines that they can like slide in. Making sure that they have enough emergency paper ballots. Making sure that they have copies of the paper poll books in case their electronic poll books crash. Making sure that they're not running out of provisional ballots, that they have enough pens, that they have enough poll workers who can troubleshoot with issues. We found that those jurisdictions that actually had an adequate number of supplies handled the crises better, which makes sense, right? Because, you know, we were in a position, especially in a place like Georgia, where our backups were failing, right? So you have emergency paper ballots because the voting machines, you need something that happens when the voting machines are broken, but then when the emergency paper ballots run out, then what do you have? You've had a failure, and then our fail-safe doesn't work. So those are the kinds of things that we need to make sure that each polling place has some resiliency to deal with some of the crisis. Okay, and the last big bucket is we expect that people are going to be increasing their use of vote by mail. So we need to make sure that all those extra mail ballots are now getting counted. This has a lot of different components. The first is how many people have access to it. I'm really excited to say that one of the big reforms that we saw was that many of the states that require excuses in order to vote by mail have changed their policies, or at least changed their policies in terms for this election to account for COVID. So it's not the same as everybody who wants to vote by mail can vote by mail, but if you have a legitimate COVID concern, you'll be able to vote by mail in every state but a small handful, right? You'll be able to, they've either expanded their definition of disability, or they've made it so that everybody can vote by mail, you know, for the short term and the like, which has been very, very helpful. And then the second thing is that we need to make sure that every voter is getting a mail ballot application. So how is it that we are getting to the point of where people know how they vote, like how they get their ballot? When are they going to get it? Are they going to get it in time? I'm excited to say that a number of states are sending all of their registered voters mail ballot applications, and some states, including the state of New Jersey and the state of California, are actually sending actual ballots. So voters don't have to go to the trouble of requesting one. They just have to return it if they get it. Some states have online voter request forms whereby voters can request a ballot online. And some are finding other ways to get ballot applications to people. Nationwide, we have about 17 states that are providing prepaid postage, so nobody has to worry about finding a postage stamp in order to return their ballot. And we see other people trying to figure out ways to make sure that like the cost of a stamp or the presence of a stamp isn't impeding people. And then we're seeing a relaxation of things like notary requirements and witness requirements so that people who want to vote by mail don't have to go through these extra hurdles. Now, of course, there's still going to be some holdout states, still some states that require that, and that is disenfranchising and a tragedy. But, you know, the states that are doing that are fewer in number, and that is something that we can all feel good about. And then we are seeing election administrators trying to be creative about how voters. So not only do some voters be able to vote by person and some can vote by mail, some of them are going to have curbside voting or drive-through voting or drop boxes that people can vote at, which is all these very encouraging reforms that people should be feeling excited about to see happening. Unfortunately, on the other side, we're seeing groups and campaigns try to stop those things. So these are active fights that are happening right now. And then finally, folks are looking really, really hard at why is it that mail ballots don't get counted. A big one is that they get returned too late. States have different rules regarding whether or not when you return a mail ballot and under what circumstances. In some cases, those laws are changing either because of legislative action or because of court action. But one thing that we can always do is encourage all voters to be voting early, however way you're going to vote. If you're going to vote in person and your state has early voting, show up and vote early. If you're voting by mail, you know, request that ballot early and apply for that ballot and return that ballot early. So those are some of the things that we can do to try and make sure that our democracy includes more of us, and that it is one in which we can all feel good about our opportunity to provide options for people. Because I really think when there's a time of crisis, voters need more options, not fewer. And it's really a shame that many of our politicians are trying to constrict our options. I want to close with a couple of thoughts. Like the first is that there's going to be a lot of gloom and doom out there about everything that's going to go wrong on election day. And I'll be the first person to say it's going to be pretty bumpy. I think we're in for a pretty bumpy ride. But our elections are important, and the vast majority of Americans are not going to have a problem on election day. And it would just be a real tragedy if the same politicians who were starving our election systems and discrediting our vote by mail processes and putting barriers in front of our ballot boxes were then rewarded by all of us not turning out or all of us staying home. Like if we really want to make change, we need to tell our politicians that we care about voting and that we're going to vote for politicians that care about voting. I always like to say that voters need to vote for voting, right? Voters need to vote for voting. We need to make sure that we're out there letting our politicians know that our right to vote is really, really important to us. The other thing that I want to end with is more of a personal reflection. So we started off talking about Justice Ginsburg, and I think part of the big tragedy of 2020 is not only COVID and not only police brutality and not only the fact that we all have to get used to remote learning and not only that we lost Justice Ginsburg, but we lost all that in the same year that we lost Representative Lewis. You know, and that's just like, that's a lot of loss for all of us to deal with. And that's a lot of moral guidance and moral force that is missing from this country. And I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Lewis on a number of occasions. And, you know, as a member of Congress and as someone who does a lot with Congress, I was lucky to be in a number of rooms that he was in. And I once heard him talk about a story that he actually wrote about in one of his memoirs called Walking with the Wind. And I think people should read it if they haven't. But he tells this beautiful story about how when he was a child, and they grew up desperately poor, he was in one of his aunt's houses, and they started experiencing just really atrocious weather. It was some sort of tornado, some sort of hurricane, where it was so strong that the house that they were in, and it was a modest house because they were modest people, like started getting lifted off of its foundation. And he tells the story about how he gathered with his cousins and his aunts as children, and they would walk to the corner of the house that was getting lifted up. And then as another corner started lifting, they would move directions and they would walk in another corner. And I think that that is just such a beautiful and apt analogy for the moment that we're in, where like our house, our democracy is being threatened by incredibly powerful forces, forces so strong that they might rip us off their foundation if we let them. But even modest people, like children even, can save the house if they join hands and walk in the same direction together. And I hope when you guys are starting the school year that you think about who are you joining hands with and in what direction are you walking? Because if anything that Mr. Lewis's life and that particular story tells us is that if you take care of your corner, that's going to do a lot to keep the house on its foundation. And so your corner may be Greenwich Village, your corner may be your home state, your corner may be your dorm room. But like if you take care of your corner, and you're going to do a lot to make sure that the democracy that we need and the democracy that we deserve and the democracy that we love prevails, and that we can make sure that the American ideals and the promises that we make to this country are something that we actually can make good on. So I wish you the best of luck. I would say that, you know, the Brennan Center takes term time interns. We take summer interns. I'm really easy to reach. My email is just myrna.bettis@nyu.edu, like most of you guys. I hope you will stay in touch, and I wish you the best of luck for the year.
Great, thank you very much, Myrna, for that overview and those very moving words at the end. Our next speaker is Robert Paul Hartley, professor at the Columbia School of Social Work and author of the recent report, Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign. So Rob.
Great, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be joining you here. I appreciate the invitation, especially because I would want to come anyway just to hear the presentation from Myrna that we all just heard. So I really appreciate that. So I'm going to share some slides here, and so this will be kind of an empirical exploration. And as a way of a little bit of introduction and background, so I'm an economist who is working at the School of Social Work at Columbia, and I've participated with the Poor People's Campaign before. And by the way, I appreciate the remarks about Representative Lewis. I'm from Georgia, and that was my representative. And of course, John Lewis's work through the years has really inspired. That work is the foundation of this current Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend Dr. William Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris. So the campaign reached out to me. I had done some poverty statistics for them in the past and have some relationships there with the campaign. And typically, this isn't my typical kind of work. I'm usually thinking about how social policy affects those who are living in poverty. But this was an opportunity to flip it around and say, well, what is the potential for low income and those living in poverty to change the policies that they face? So this was just a data exploration of how much potential is there, and then what is the likely impact that could have if low-income folks were to vote in higher numbers. So I'll just take us through some results from the study. And I want to begin just showing some trends over time. And this is broken out by presidential elections and midterm elections. So all the presidential elections have higher voting turnouts, right? But everywhere you can see that the voting rates of higher income, and here we're using the marker of 200% of the poverty line. So those that have incomes less than 200% of the poverty line are considered low income in the study, and everyone else is in the higher income category. And so you can see that higher income voters are more likely to show up at the polls. And by the way, there was a great summary of this work in the New York Times saying that their version of the conclusion of the report was rich people still vote more. I thought that was I kind of laughed a little bit. It's fairly snarky, but okay, yes, the trends are showing that there's higher rates of voter participation among higher income. It's about a 20 percentage point difference between higher and lower income in every year. But a couple of things just from these trends that stood out to me was that they move together, really. So in years that higher income folks are voting more, so are those with lower incomes, right? They're both responding to the macroeconomy, to policies and issues changing over time. And there's a similar propensity to really increase the vote in elections like our most recent one. In the 2018 midterm, the voter participation rates increased by about 10 percentage points for both low income and higher income voters. And for the lower income voters, that 10 percentage points was about a 33%, about a 1/3 increase in their voter participation rate. So in this midterm, there was lots more voter participation. And in fact, 2016 was a year of particularly disillusioned voters, people that weren't wanting to vote because they didn't think it mattered, or they weren't interested, or the candidates weren't speaking to them. But there's a real turnaround in 2018. I would like to say I'm optimistic that there's really high levels of engagement this year as well. I think that there certainly is a lot of motivation. But then, yes, when it comes to election day, we'll see. But actually, not just election day, right? People coming out voting early. So I'm optimistic that there's a strong showing. So, but based on this motivation, I want to go into the question of what would happen if low-income voters voted more. How can we characterize the kind of political power that they could have if they showed up more? And then maybe at the end, be able to come back to talking about the question again of, so why aren't they voting, and what would it take? But first, just to try to, again, characterize how large is this group. One way of doing it is just showing here, and I'm going to show a series of 3 maps in a row. So these will kind of build on each other, getting to the answer of, well, okay, how can this matter? So in this map, I want to answer the question, how large is the non-voting low-income population, the eligible non-voters that have low incomes? How large is that group compared to the total electorate? So you can see here that in several states that the low-income non-voters are about 1/5 of the total electorate in states like Arkansas, Mississippi, and even in coal country states like Kentucky and West Virginia. So, so in several of these states, about 1 out of 5 eligible voters are low-income and non-voting. So, so that's kind of a first sweep of saying, okay, there's a sizable population here. Next, to start getting closer to how much could that matter, what I'm going to do is compare the size of the low-income eligible non-voters by state to the most recent presidential margins of victory. So this next map is showing for the 2016 presidential election, what percent of low-income voters that were not voting, they're eligible voters, but they're not voting, what percent of the eligible non-voters would it take to equal the margin of victory? So just to take a specific example, in Michigan, just 1% of eligible non-voting low-income individuals. If 1% of them were to actually show up at the polls and vote, that would have equaled the margin of victory in Michigan. So as you look around at these numbers, they're going to be a function of both how large is the low-income population, as well as how small was the margin of victory. But you can see in states like Pennsylvania, some very small numbers, 4% of low-income eligible non-voters would have equaled the margin of victory in Pennsylvania. But in other states that might be a little bit more surprising, like Florida, the number was only 7% in Florida. So this is starting to get closer again of the question I want to answer. How much could it matter? Now, the thing about this is that it will only matter in these states if 100% of those new voters voted against whoever had won in 2016, right? So take Florida. I'm saying if 7% of low-income non-voters showed up and voted, that would equal the margin of victory, but it wouldn't change the outcome unless all of those voters were to vote against the party that had won. So the next question that I'm going to try to answer is, based on the data, and I don't think I said this at the beginning, but I'm using data from the current population survey, their November supplement. So based on the data, to be able to say whether an outcome could have changed or not, I have to hold some number fixed. I have to decide how many are voting, and then how many of them are voting for one party or the other. So to try to fix a number and get at this answer a little closer, I decided to do the thought experiment of what would it look like if the low-income electorate voted at the same rate as the higher income electorate. And if they did, how many of them would have to vote against whoever won in 2016 to change the outcome? So now it's a scenario where, okay, the low-income population is voting at the same rates as higher income. If they vote, but if they split their vote, all these new potential voters, if they split their vote 50-50, then again, there's no change. So what percentage? It'll have to be greater than 50% and less than 100%, or else it would be infeasible, right? So the next map here is showing this scenario for the 2016 election. So again, if we just start with Michigan, that would say in Michigan, it would just take, if we increased low-income voters to the higher income voting rates, and then of those new voters, it would take a simple majority of only 51% in Michigan to turn that state from it went Republican in 2016 to turn it in the other direction. So I'm showing 15 states that could have changed outcomes. 10 of them were Republican and could have potentially switched to Democrat. 5 were Democrat, could have potentially switched to Republican. And by the way, in the report, the focus was to be nonpartisan. And as an economist, I feel like that should be my true nature, is being very unbiased, nonpartisan. But just looking at what is the power of the low-income vote, because even for the Poor People's Campaign, they're not in the business of endorsing candidates. They're trying to create a platform that candidates want to endorse. And there's also not a sense that the low-income population would vote as one unified bloc. They could have differing opinions of, they could have differing political opinions. So really the exercise is about if low-income population were more active in the polls, they could have a stronger voice. They could have more influence in the political process, and that might shape the way that right now it is. I think that there's a sense that no one's speaking to low-income voters because they don't show up to vote. But you could also think that low-income voters aren't showing up because nobody's speaking to them. And so Poor People's Campaign and others are really trying to organize and mobilize people to lift up their voices, so they have to be heard, and that people will start to respond and listen. So this is just an indication that not all of these states would certainly be ones where the outcome might change, but there's enough states here that I think that low-income voters showing up, demanding that their concerns be heard, could start to make an influence. And as Dean Morrison was saying about Justice Ginsburg's legacy, that there's an element here of the long view of durable change. This might not necessarily change all of the landscape this year for this election, But I agree with Myrna's sense of optimism that we almost have to just begin with the culture of voting, begin with the idea that every voice matters, and find ways to keep working toward that. And then I think that we can step into and become the people that we want to be, right? If we exercise our rights and we get engaged. So one thing I also want to note here is just another connection back to that Shelby versus Holder case mentioned earlier. So the Voting Rights Act imposed these pre-clearance conditions on certain states that had histories of racially biased voter suppression, and some of those pre-clearance conditions were lifted in the Shelby versus Holder decision. And what's notable in some of these results is that a lot of the states you see here were states that had the pre-clearance conditions, at least in full or partially, and that would include North Carolina, Florida, Texas, I think Georgia and Mississippi as well. Yeah. So these southern states that you see showing up, in some sense, they're surprising that these are states where low-income voice could really matter and change an outcome. I mentioned only a simple majority in Michigan would change an outcome, but in Florida, 70% is not a large. I mean, that's kind of a feasible number of those new lower-income voters that could really change Florida. And Texas is actually a state that I've heard people talking about could be up for grabs this year. So I don't think it's also accidental that some of these pre-clearance states are showing up in the study. Partly you could think that the history of voter suppression in these states could be contributing to this artificially built up potential for low-income voters. Their potential is larger because they've already been kind of pushed out of the process in some ways to non-participating. But I think it's a good opportunity this year. There's been so much activism throughout the summer, and unfortunately through really terrible circumstances. But hopefully this is a time where people can come together and build momentum in this way. So let me come back to the question, if I have a few minutes here, that of why people aren't voting. And I've made some references to voter suppression, but the survey doesn't ask directly about that. The survey is asking some of the responses that you see here. So none of these questions rules out other reasons why people might not be voting. But these are some of the main reasons that they're citing. And one thing I just want to point out is that on average, over all these years, the low-income and higher income voters aren't very different, especially on one of the top reasons, which is that they're not interested in the candidates. People aren't speaking to them. And this could be more of a sign that candidates that take this lower income group seriously and think about their concerns, whether it's around healthcare or income maintenance, but candidates that are speaking to them can make a difference. Anecdotally, I know that a lot of folks out in coal country, like in Eastern Kentucky, were saying that we don't really necessarily trust either candidate, but we know when they're coming and they're speaking directly to us, and that matters. So I mean, people want to know that their issues are important, they're being spoken to. So, but I will say that illness or disability is more likely to keep lower income folks away from the polls, and as is, I believe. Well, now I'm looking at my my numbers. I was going to say transportation problems, but yeah, transportation problems it's one of the smaller ones, 5% on average, but much bigger issue than for higher income folks for sure. But that illness or disability is definitely one that is connected to this next point, which is the issue of voting by mail. So I really appreciate that perspective earlier, that voting by mail is by no means a panacea for elections now or going forward, but they certainly are becoming much more popular over time. So this is just showing the trends and the percent of folks who are voting, whether or not they're voting by mail. And it's more prevalent among those with health limitations and those over 65 and over. The differences between low income and high income are practically none. They're very similar over time. And in fact, another thing just to point out, it may have been said earlier, but there really are no partisan differences in outcomes by voting by mail. And several studies are showing that, and I can provide some links if anyone is interested. So it's increasingly common over time. It's about a quarter of our votes right now are by mail. And it's definitely an institution to support and continue to make stronger for access for all. So I'll just wrap up by noting that at the Columbia School of Social Work, a lot of our students are becoming very, very engaged and taking a leadership role. And one of the things they've started up is social work votes. And so it's always great to support your students, right? And so I just wanted to share tomorrow, Reverend Dr. William Barber is going to be speaking at 12 noon. So if anyone wants to join in that, there's still time to sign up and join us. And there are a couple of other events, phone banking, if anyone is looking for ways to get involved. And then lastly, I'll just share that here's a link for the report if anyone is interested in checking that out further. And again, I just want to thank you for the time here. Really appreciate getting to join you. So I'll turn it back to John.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. And kind of building on the spirit of Rob's penultimate reply, or penultimate slide about opportunities to get involved, we have Abe Nelson, who's a current Wagner student and one of the co-coordinators of Wagner's Vote 2020 initiative, with a few ideas and opportunities for people to get involved. If people have any questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A, and we'll, if we don't have an answer for you right now, we'll be sure to get one to you. Turn it over to Abe.
Hey everybody, like John said, I'm Abe Nelson. I'm a current second year MPA PNP student specializing in advocacy and political action at Wagner. And just want to talk to you guys really quickly about Vote 2020, and I'll try and keep it short because I know we all spend a lot of time on Zoom these days, and if I make us go over the 6 p.m. end time, everyone will be angry at me and then won't sign up for anything. So that would be self-defeating. But basically, you might have heard about Vote 2020. We've been trying to promote it, and it's essentially a program to get NYU students and particularly Wagner students more politically involved. And so it started this summer as essentially a fellowship matching program where John and Erica Boldy and some other professors, part of this collective called Wagner Seed, or NYU Seed, tried to match Wagner and NYU students with political organizations that were involved in voter access, voter protection, get out the vote, and place students in these fellowship opportunities there. And that is ongoing into the fall. So you might have heard about that. And John can share a link to applications for that and interest forms for that if anyone is interested in trying to make that happen in these last few months. But now we're moving into what's called our final push. And basically, it's two different prongs that are very closely related. One is to get everyone at NYU that we can to pledge to vote and to get their friends to vote. Because if you are attending this panel, this hour-long panel about voting, you're all voting. There's no one on here that is not, or I'd be very surprised. But you probably have friends or family who are thinking about not voting, or for many of the reasons that Rob shared in his data, might have some barrier to voting, that they might be worried about vote by mail, et cetera. Those are the kind of people that we're also trying to reach through peer-to-peer, because we can send out as many emails as we want, but a lot of those won't reach people as effectively as you talking to people within your networks who might have those concerns. So that's part of what we're trying to do. We're doing that with NYU Votes, which is a great initiative that's university-wide. And then in addition to that, we're trying to get people to get involved beyond just voting. And how that looks is going to differ for person to person. But basically, it's about committing yourself to volunteering in some way that matches your political values, whatever those may be. And they might not be anything like mine, but making sure that everyone makes that commitment and is trying to make sure that other people are also doing something that matches their values, that people in their networks that are their friends, classmates, colleagues, et cetera, are also taking that pledge in these last 43 days before the election. And personally, I woke up on November 9th, 2016, and I felt like I hadn't done enough. And that was a really rough feeling that I've carried with me for 4 years, and other people might have felt the same way. And I don't want to feel that way on November 4th, 2020, or however many months the election drags on after the election day. But basically, we'll be reaching out with more information about this. I'm going to circulate just 2 simple resources. One is called Motivote, which is a platform to basically a one-stop shop. Check your registration, make your voting plan, request an absentee ballot if you want. And it was made by Wagner grads, so you know it's good. And then the other thing is just an interest form to see what kind of volunteer activities folks are involved in. And that's everything from being a poll worker. I sent out information on that to a group of people who already indicated interest earlier today, to getting involved in various political kinds of activities. And even though we won't necessarily be able to promote specific campaigns, specific organizations that are partisan, et cetera, we do want to try and get people to make that commitment and to get involved. And so we will be sending out some things on that in the near future. But the last thing I want to say is don't feel obligated to wait for me or wait for that for Vote 2020. Like, I am going to be, for example, attending a text bank that the ACLU has organized to get voters registered. I'll be doing that tomorrow through their People Power platform. I'm doing a NARAL text bank next week. And those are organizations that match my values. I'm not saying that anyone has to do those events, but see if you can find an organization that matches your values, or if you're already volunteering, I'm sure a lot of you are, then try and make sure that you're talking to your friends, people in your networks, and encouraging them to do exactly what you're doing, because that's fantastic. And so that's pretty much all I've got. If you have questions, again, please feel free to send them, to put them in the chat, or you can reach out to, I'll put the link, but we have an alias email, vote2020@nyu.edu, that I'll put in there, so y'all can reach out as well. But yeah, that's all I got. John, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. Well, we have a question for you, Abe. One is about the role of international students. And can international students be engaged in the Vote 2020 initiative and promoting voter mobilization?
Absolutely, completely, yes. And obviously, will you be able to pledge to vote? No. But does this election impact you if you are a student at an American university like New York University? Absolutely it does, and your voice absolutely matters, so yes. There's certain things, so for example, if you want to be a poll worker in New York State, you have to be a registered New York State voter, so there's some things that won't necessarily be on the table, but as far as promoting causes that match your values and trying to get people registered, trying to get out the vote, trying to make sure that every vote is counted, that is absolutely something that is not just the domain of American NYU students. That is something all NYU students can be involved in. So that's a great question, and thank you for raising that.
And the other thing, Abe, is in addition to being a poll worker, where you would actually work at the polling station to make sure the election is proceeding, you could be a poll watcher if you're concerned about efforts at voter suppression, as we've seen in Virginia recently, in terms of interfering with people trying to vote early. Where would be a good place for people if they were interested in doing that kind of poll watching?
So there's a great government website called Help America Vote. I'm going to put that in here, and that has information about poll watching. Regulations vary from state to state, from city to city, but in New York, you do have to be a registered voter. In New York, I think in New York City, if you want to do it in New York City, but I can put that link in there. And if you're interested in that, that's another great way to get involved that goes beyond voting, which is what we're trying to encourage. So I'm going to drop 3 links in the chat in the next minute or so.
Great. There's also,
keep it coming.
866 Our Vote is mobilizing people around kind of other efforts, and you can plug in there and connect if you happen to be, elsewhere in the country or have friends, cousins, frenemies elsewhere in the country to connect. That's also a place. Back to our international students question, international students can also, for example, write letters or postcards that say the Sunrise Movement and Vote Forward are doing to encourage people to go to the polling place. As long as you don't pay for postage, you cannot make any financial contributions if you're not a citizen with respect to the election. But your labor, you can donate your labor, and that's totally acceptable. And so we encourage folks to do that. And some of the links that Abe are putting up, if people have any questions about kind of organizations to connect with, or I'm not entirely sure, what I want to do, what would be some options, Abe and Alexis and Maggie, the kind of folks who are doing, leading this work at Wagner amongst the students, are happy to give you some advice. So any other questions? Where it looks like we're coming up on time. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thank to our speakers, Dean Morrison, Myrna Perez, and Rob Hartley. I think this was a really interesting town hall. Please keep your eye peeled, as Rob mentioned and Myrna mentioned also. Tomorrow's voter registration day. There's going to be a range of events happening both at NYU. So if you do with the Reverend tomorrow at noon, there's going to be a particular event hosted by a leader of Gen Vote tomorrow, specifically looking at young people in voting, that NYU Votes is sponsoring. And this is the opportunity to have everyone put on their calendars. Wagner will be hosting an election night gathering from 6 until, who knows, the sun comes up on the evening of November 3rd. And so that's open to the entire community. So jot it down on your calendars, and we'll be coming out with some more information about that. We'll leave this open for a little bit for people who want to capture any of the links that Abe's been posting in the chat. The Motivote platform is open to people who are, not NYU affiliated. It's really there for everyone to be involved. We would like to lay claim to that, since Motivote was founded by Wagner students, and so just a plug for them. And they've been incredibly supportive of the NYU Votes efforts. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and keep your eyes peeled for future events. We look forward to see you out there virtually or in person getting out the vote. And to Professor Foldy's question, yes, the Wagner Election Night event is a virtual event. So it will be virtual. Okay, we're coming up on 6. Thanks again, everyone, for your participation. Abe, thanks for throwing all this great information out to people. And thank you all for enabling us to honor the legacy of John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg by trying to think about how to deepen and defend our democracy. Have a great evening, everyone.